Good evening, everybody. My name is Karl Stabnau. I'm director here of concerts and jazz band, and welcome to our spring concert. You probably noticed tonight we're fighting with Homecoming, so we're a little bit less electronic than they are, so I hope you enjoy the performance that we have. We're going to start off with concert band tonight, and our theme for concert band is going to be the medieval period. So we have a lot of pieces that either are inspired by tales of dragons or mythical beasts, or have to do with earth and elemental forces. So we're going to start off the first portion of this concert with two different works, and just because they're longer pieces, I'm going to introduce the first two works that we're going to do, and then I'll introduce the next two as we kind of go from there. The first work that we're going to do is excerpts from the symphony from Lord of the Rings. So if all of you are familiar, or many of you are familiar with the movie franchise, this is not from the movie franchise. This actually predates the movie franchise and the music that came from there that was Academy Award winning. This particular suite was written in the 1980s, written between 1984 and 1987, and originally written based on the stories from the book. And a lot of the music that's here fell into the canon of wind ensemble and wind band arrangements, and some of the themes actually did influence the later music that was written for the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy in the early 2000s. So you're going to hear first the Lord of the Rings excerpts from the symphony. Following that, there is a short four-movement work that features, it's called Elements, Elemental Forces. You'll hear the four different movements cover forces such as air, water, earth, and fire. So I'll leave those to the imagination. I won't announce them, but those are your four choices. See if you can pick out what sounds like air, or water, or fire, or earth. So I hope you enjoy the first half of our program tonight. This is excerpts from the symphony from Lord of the Rings, followed by our suite called Elements. so much. We're going to continue, as I mentioned, with elements. Again, you're going to hear in elements 4 different types of elemental forces represented: water, air, fire, and earth. So see if you can match the music with which one it is. This is elements. so I'm going to let the band catch their breath for a minute and flip over to our next couple songs. So I do want to mention the one that we just played called Elements. I said there were 4 different elements that we were representing musically. So for those of you who are trying to guess which ones, the very first movement that we played, very light feeling to it, that was called Air, meant to signify and represent this feeling of air and of peace. The slow movement that we played second is called Water, which had that wonderful clarinet line to it, and then a beautiful brass section in the center that was almost hymn-like, that was Water. The third movement in that set that kind of had that light playfulness, that was entitled Earth. That particular movement the composer chose to model after, if any of you are familiar with Holst's The Planets, that was modeled after the feeling of Mercury, a particular movement from that suite called Mercury. And then finally, that driving, kind of rhythmic, exciting part, that was called Fire. So that was a representation of the elements. We're going to continue on now with our last 2 pieces of the concert band set. Again, we're featuring kind of this medieval, Middle Earth, elemental type theme. So we wanted to pick some things that kind of fit into that vein. So the next piece was written by a more modern composer. It's entitled The Cave You Fear, which was meant to be this inner journey of challenges and of battling monsters and all kinds of different fun things along the way, represented by the sounds of being in a cave and being in the dark and being unknown. So we thought that fit our kind of medieval and fighting dragons theme quite well. So we're going to continue now with The Cave You Fear. do have one more for you for this portion of our set. This one a lot of you will recognize from the DreamWorks movie How to Train Your Dragon. This is excerpts from that movie for How to Train Your Dragon, so please enjoy. Thank you so much. We're going to take like 2.5 minutes. We're going to switch over for the Brockport Jazz Ensemble. Please don't leave. It's great having a full audience here. We have about 25 minutes worth more music. So while they're getting, they're going to stand up there until you keep applauding for them.